Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today with a very special guest, Flo Crivello. Flo was a product manager and engineer at Uber for 4.5 years and has now set out to start his next thing. Flo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Flo, before we get into Uber specifically, when you sort of look back at the arc of your career to date, what do you think is the thread that you've kept on pulling, or the thing that has most motivated you to make certain decisions? What you spend your time doing?
Yeah, I would probably say it's and I only answer this question now because I was actually wondering the same question recently, and it's the first time that I identified this. But I would say a sense of adventure, right? And when you ask people what they're optimizing for in life, like very often people think that the most common questions are going to be either money or career or family or happiness. And I actually think that adventure is one of the most interesting questions out there, right? And so that and probably independence, right? And so when I left France, I was 20, and I just saw more and more that, well, first of all, Silicon Valley was the place to be if you were in tech. And two, I just did not see myself aligned with what France had to offer, like politically and economically and all of that. And so I just took like a very rapid decision. And like within 3 weeks, I had like closed my company and gave back my apartment and just moved here with very little plan. And I think that was that. There was like a quest for adventure and a quest for independence.
Yeah. When I think about what I know of you, I sort of think about someone who's like really excited about markets and progress and meritocracy and agency. Do you see, like, how do you sort of compare yourself when you said you weren't sort of resonating with French culture politically or economically? Like, what is the difference there, and how do you sort of explain how you are so different?
Yeah, it's hard to overstate, and people don't realize, because superficially, France and the US are very similar, right? Like when you're in the street, like people, it's a Western country, right? But in its philosophy, people don't realize how very different, and not just France, but the old world and Europe and the US remain, right? There is this amazing quote that I love from Marie Antoinette, who disdainfully said of Benjamin Franklin, who was, a diplomat in France for the last part of his life. And she said, like a mere printer's foreman could never have risen to such rank in Europe, right? And she was saying that like it was a good thing, right? And Benjamin Franklin would have wholeheartedly agreed was what the biography was commenting. And like Europe is a lot more class conscious, and there are really multiple classes in Europe, right? And so there is a political class. There is this very little school that's called the ENA, and like something like 90% of prime ministers and presidents of the last 5 decades are coming from that tiny school that has something like 200 students a year. And just a tiny, tiny incestuous class, right? And likewise I hate using this word, but there is still somewhat of a bourgeoisie in France, right? When I arrived here in the US, I was surprised at how available everyone was, right? And like the very first weekend I was here in San Francisco, I was in Dolores Park, and I saw some guy who was doing a barbecue, and I walked up to him and I was like, "Are you Dustin Moskovitz?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And like he made me a hot dog, and I was like, "This is amazing!" Like it's like the guy was like totally casual. He was like, yeah, and like in the US, just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you don't mingle with other people, right? And people don't realize that in the US. Like, yeah, I mean, why? You're just a guy, right? And people don't realize that in France either. They don't realize that in France, most of the billionaires don't want, not only do they not want to hang out with you, but they don't want you to hang out with their daughter.
Yeah.
Right. There is this notion of class for sure.
Why is that, in the sense of why is America different, and why hasn't the old world evolved or changed?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just very, very deeply rooted in the ethos of America, right? It is really about equality. There is this amazing book that's called The Radicalism of the American Revolution, that was saying that basically America was the first country that built a system where there was no class in several senses of the term. I just think that was, from the beginning, that was the positioning of America. And so there was and still is a selection effect of people who came here, right? And forwent comfort, especially in the early days, and took a risk, right, for freedom and for independence. and because they wanted to build a better life for themselves, right? And still today, the selection effect is huge, right? When I look at my friends, like very many of my friends decided to leave France, and some of them moved to the US, and very many of them decided to stay in France. And no offense to the latter, but there is certainly a very big difference in mindset between these two, right? And so America is a country of risk takers, right? I think because of this selection effect and because of this very early positioning philosophically.
Yeah. And so, we're just recording this, after July 4th weekend. What is it sort of weird that you are more patriotic than people who are born here? What is your sort of sense of sort of some anti-American sentiment among native-born Americans? Like, how do you make sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is pretty common for, it's kind of like also in the cults or like in the religions, like the converted is always a much more fervent believer in the cause than the native, right? I think it's very natural for people to take for granted whatever it is they have, right? And so Americans take prosperity and they take liberty for granted. And they think that they can, that is also why we're seeing a resurgence of socialist thinking in the US, because they think that they can have their cake and eat it too. It's like, oh, why don't we implement all of these policies? Wouldn't the world be so amazing? It's like, well, actually, all of these things that you don't even notice anymore, they would probably disappear if we implemented these things. You just don't even see them, right? And so the grass is always greener, and everybody just sees like, oh, we could be this amazing socialist country. It's like, well, actually, your country is pretty darn good, and you just don't notice it. And so coming from a country which I think the GDP per capita of France is something like 30 or 40% lower than in the US, at least, right? I do appreciate what America has to offer.
Yeah. And when you say the things that we don't notice that would probably, be decreased, that we take for granted, are you referring to GDP per capita? Are you referring to certain civil liberties, or what are you speaking towards?
I am referring to GDP per capita. I am referring to ease of doing business. I am referring to general frictionlessness in business life that people don't realize. It's just in France, the bureaucracy is infuriating. There is this thing in France where the labor code is, you should see these pictures. It's like thousands and thousands of pages long. Nobody understands it. And there is this thing where they had the sense to be like, oh, we don't want to kill startups. It's just too much regulation. So we're going to do a thing where some regulations only kick in at certain thresholds. And one of the most important thresholds is number of employees, and it's like 50 employees. So once you have 50 employees, all of a sudden, so many regulations kick in. Yeah. And so France has this peculiarity that there are something like 3 times as many firms with 49 employees as there are with 50 employees. Yeah. Right? Once you cross 50 employees, you're going to have labor inspectors who are literally, and I use the word literally, Marxists. Right? They almost have like the right book under their arm, and they come in your company and they despise you. They hate you. Right? Even though you're feeding them, right? You're the taxpayer here, and you're the one creating jobs, and they despise you, right? Because you're an exploiter of the proletariat, and they tell you actually you're exploiting your people in this way, and this way, and this way, because they have like 2 square inch less than like the regulation says, and all of that stuff. And then also like low unemployment, right? I'm not up to date anymore on France, but last time I checked, I think unemployment was like 9.5 points. And I think in the US it is, well, I mean, right now it's COVID, but before COVID, I think it was like 3.7. That's like a huge difference. Right. Yeah.
Did you ever have a Marxist phase? And if so, how did you, if not, how did you avoid it?
Never. I read Ayn Rand very early. Yeah. At an impressionable age, maybe when I was 15 or 16. It was actually a clandestine translation. Right. And so I've kind of like, I'm more moderated than I used to be when I was a teenager, but very, very early on, I was not very aligned with leftist thinking.
Yeah. You let's get back to adventure. So you're optimizing for adventure. How does Uber give that sense of adventure to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Uber, especially in the earlier days, there were few better places to learn, because it is just one thing that people don't realize about Uber is like it's just so darn decentralized. They really empower people very, very early on with a ton of responsibility, right? And a common story for people who start at Uber is like, hey, do X. It's like, wait, me? Like, do I have a team? Like, who's supervising me? Like, what's all? It's like, no, you just do X, right? And so they give you huge chunks of businesses to own, and that really helps you grow as a business person. And you were more then than now, but still that remains true to some extent today. You had a huge latitude over how you pursued that mission that they gave you.
before we get to lessons, why don't you talk about the misconceptions around Uber and how Uber is sort of understood in popular culture?
Yeah, I think people see it as one of the things that happened. Obviously, is like the Susan Fowler thing, and obviously, like what happened is inexcusable and should never have happened, right? And I think Uber reacted strongly and rightly so. I think that created the wrong impression that Uber is just or was this place where there was a lot of sexual harassment and whatnot, right? And a lot of people, and I believe Susan herself, right? But a lot of feminists and such said that actually this was representative of the whole industry, right? And that Uber was no better or no worse than a lot of other places on that dimension. I know a few women actually from Uber who said that, and Margaret Ensinger posted a public post on this, that she said she was actually grateful for Uber and for its culture because she's naturally aggressive. And that was one place that actually allowed her as a woman to be aggressive, right? And that did not ask her, actually, you gotta like be softer, you gotta be more mellow, you gotta smile, like none of that, right? It's like actually that aggressivity was celebrated to some extent at Uber. I think that is one of the main misconceptions. I think people have this notion of Uber as like kind of like these business sharks, right? And in my experience, Uber is just like any other company. It's people who are well-meaning, right? They really want to do the right thing. And they want to build a good product and a good service for people. And I think they've succeeded at that, right? And sometimes some things went wrong. But look, I mean, during my tenure, I think Uber hired something like 800 people a month on average. And so that kind of growth is bound to come with a lot of chaos, right? And so a lot of HR processes were not together, just a lot of stuff. It was like it was an adult in a baby's body, right? And so a lot of stuff was bound to happen. But I think I wish more people who dislike Uber came for a few days inside the company and got a chance to talk to people inside Uber and just saw that like they're with people and they mean well.
Yeah. And I felt like Uber was the fall of Uber was sort of emblematic of how there was really just this sort of, negative perception of the tech industry in general. Like they sort of coincided and Uber was sort of, a metaphor for that. When you try to make sense of that, of why technology industry started being viewed much more negatively, like post-Trump, basically. How do you sort of make sense of it? What is the mental model you use to sort of understand? Because it used to be much more friendly, in the earlier.
Sure. Well, I think there are two parts to my answer, right? Like one of them pertains just to Uber and the other to the tech industry in general. In the case of Uber, there was this reputation and this image of like this hard charging ethos and like the Travis brand and such, right? And then Travis was on the console of Trump. And so it kind of like muddied the waters. And so there was this conflation that was made between Trump and Travis and Uber and all of that. So I think this was part of what happened in 2017 was people were angry and they were looking for something to hit on, right? Then when it comes to really the evolving dynamic between the media and Uber in the tech industry in the last few years, I think there is the charitable explanation and then there is the uncharitable one. I'll start with the uncharitable one. The uncharitable explanation is first, the tech industry is a competitor to the news industry, right? And especially newspapers. Like Benedict Evans put out that deck recently that shows the share of advertising in the US that was captured by TV, by newspapers, by social media, right? And social media, the growth of social media has been vastly done at the expense of newspapers' revenue. And so tech has disrupted a lot of industries out there, right? And it's disrupted finance and education, but it has disrupted none more so than the media. And so I think that is one thing that people need to realize when they read these articles that are very anti-tech, is that you're reading almost like a press release from the Pepsi company against the Coca-Cola company. And like they're free to make these press releases, but people read them like they're very neutral and reflective of reality. And it's like, actually, no, like you're putting a press release against a competitor, right? So I think that is one uncharitable explanation. A second uncharitable explanation is that the press has always had somewhat of an anti-capitalist strain in it, but it's become a lot more so, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years, right? And that is actually measurable. Like if you look at mentions of different keywords in the New York Times, they've gone exponential in the last decade or so, right? And the tech industry there are very successful companies there. And so it's very tempting to see them as representing capitalism, right? The most charitable explanation is that there are two charitable explanations. One of them is the tech industry has a thin skin. It is used to being treated in a much better way by the media. And so now that there is a more negative attention that is brought onto it, it is not used to it. And so it's got a thin skin and it's overreacting to that, right? Another charitable explanation is that tech is becoming important. And it is the function of the fourth estate to examine whatever is important and its role in society. And it's more important to talk about the bad stuff than the good stuff, because this is the bad stuff that we have to do something about, right? I do wish we covered more of the good stuff, but that logic makes sense.
You mentioned anti-capitalists over the past decade that sort of sentiment has increased. Why do you think that is?
Oh, there are a few books. I think Hayek wrote, is it Hayek or Thomas Sowell? I think both wrote Intellectuals and Capitalism. And they talk about how there is this misconception that capitalism rewards the most virtuous person or the smartest person, right? And that is kind of true, but not really, right? It only rewards smarts insofar as they are correlated with value delivered. At the end of the day, capitalism doesn't really care about smarts, right? And like Mozart died dirt poor, even though he was an intellectual genius and a creative genius, right? But your next door neighbor who sells whiskey is going to make a fortune, right? Capitalism rewards people who serve value for other people. If other people do not appreciate symphonies, capitalism is not going to reward you. If other people like whiskey, it is going to reward you, right? And so journalists and intellectuals hang out in the same circles as successful capitalists that made a fortune. And I think it is a little bit of a pity that our society rewards so much or attaches so much value to your wealth. And it's like, oh, your wealth is reflective of your quality as a person. And I actually think this is one of the reasons why it's a good thing that now we have other measures of quality. People always bemoan the rise of social media and like the narcissism that comes with it. It's like, oh, like who cares about your followers? I'm like, no, actually it's good. We should have other measures of someone's worth, right? Because money makes people jealous and sometimes you are a worthy person and you're not making money and that's okay because money is not a measure of your worth. And so I think journalists, by virtue of hanging out with these people and seeing that they're no smarter than them, indeed very often actually dumber than them. And they're like, well, like, you know, the system is unfair, right? Like, well, actually the system is unfair. The system is just not what you think it is.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the lessons that you learned from Uber that you find most interesting.
Yeah. I think the first one is really that decentralization, right? That decentralization exists at two levels. It exists at the HQ level and at the city level. So when Uber opens in a new city, it doesn't just like flip a switch internally and it's like, oh, now we operate in Austin. It actually opens an office there in Austin and it hires a team. And in that team, there is going to be a GM for Austin, like a general manager. And that GM is going to own their P&L, their profit and losses statement, and they are going to manage their own business. And they are going to be given a ton of tools to manage their business. Data analytics tools and communication tools to send messages to drivers and riders and payment tools and tools to have custom promotions, et cetera, right? And so that really that basically makes the company multi-threaded, right? And these teams have so many tools that really they can build entire products without HQ being involved at any point. And so I think the most spectacular example of this is Uber Eats. Right, that originally started out, it was called Uber Fresh, and it was a pilot in Los Angeles. And it was just like the old design of Uber had that slider at the bottom. I don't know if you remember. And it just like cities could edit that slider, and they just added an Uber Fresh slider. And so when you put that, they had like specific rules on the back end that they had just created, and you just got a burger delivered, right? And actually, I know the ops who was responsible for that. He actually paid the restaurants with his own personal credit card for the first year. And I think he had like $1 million on it at the end of the year or something like. And so I think that is the other lesson, right? It's like really empowering people to run their own business makes you move faster and it makes people feel like owners of their own business, right? I think another advantage of it, which is another lesson in there, and it's very congruent with, there is this book that's called Peopleware, and it's all in the title, really, right? They say it's not software, it's peopleware. And so when there is a failure in a software project, managers and engineers always jump to the process and the tooling. Like, oh, let's adopt Scrum, let's adopt Agile, let's change Asana to Jira or whatnot, right? And the case that the book makes is that no, actually 99% of the time when there is a problem, it's a psychological problem, right? The team hasn't gelled enough. They are not bought into the mission enough. They are not engaged enough. And a team that is engaged enough, that gets the psychological part right and the process part wrong, is going to succeed. And a team that gets the process right and the psychology wrong is going to fail. And I think, again, making people owners of their businesses, they're going to work harder and they're going to feel like they're in the trenches together because they don't need to ask for permission every time they need something. It's their business, it's their app, it's their city, right? And so that really, when you went to a city, when you visited the city office, you could feel that camaraderie so much, right? And people would literally sleep on the floor at the warehouse and they would be having the time of their lives. Yeah. So the decentralization, the hustling it creates, and the gelling of the team it creates, I think, are the biggest lessons here.
Totally. And it segues into just a concept you're excited about more broadly, which is permissionless innovation.
First of all, I think that's one of the most important concepts in economics. I forgot the name of this economist who was saying that, Munger. It's funny because a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize the virtues of the system that created them. It's like, well, actually, you are benefiting from permissionless innovation. You were able to create that business without having to ask for anybody's permission. And then they create their little island in the ocean of capitalism, and they create a little island where people have to ask for permission every time they want to go to the bathroom. And so in this case, I think allowing for permissionless innovation, there are like two things you need to do. One of them is cultural. You need to constantly send out the message like, hey, don't ask for permission, and default. And when someone asks you for permission because you're in the decision-making capacity, default to yes, right? And then there is one part of it also is just the software and the tooling that you build. And so Uber invested a ton in building what we call its experimentation platform. And that is something very common in the tech industry, right? And so Airbnb did the same, Snap did the same, Amazon, Facebook. And so they're basically kind of A/B testing internal tools or feature flagging tools. And so what it does is it allows you, when you're an engineer or when you're an ops or whatever, you can create features in the app or in your city. And you can very easily turn on this feature just for 5% of people who live in Austin and who run an iOS app, right? And turn it on and turn it off. And then we even had things that automatically turned off things that had negative impact on the business and such, right? And so when you do that, what you do is you take out the downside of experimentation, because now you're just experimenting on 0.X% of your user base. And the upside is uncapped, right? And so I think that this is actually one of the returns to scale that is insufficiently explored, is like, as you scale, you actually grow the downside of your experiments, right? Because when one of your experiments works, like, oh, like, look at what these guys in Austin did. Like, let's just like propagate it everywhere in the company, right? Oh, like these guys in LA created this Uber Fresh thing. Let's just create Uber Eats. And now Uber Eats is like a multi-billion-dollar business. So it uncaps the upside and it allows you to spin up a lot more experimentation threads. And the downside is constant. And then again, like there is the cultural and the psychological aspect of removing barriers to like not having people ask for permission, which is just like you make people feel like it's their business.
And is Travis like a Steve Jobsian like figure? Or another way of asking that is like, if Steve Jobs was a CEO in 2017, would he have had a quote unquote disgraced exit? Been let go after being immensely successful, and building a company? Or like, is it something about the times, or is it something where Jobs was like, he tripled down? Like, yeah, he was aggressive, but he sort of was able to like, he had a better sort of reality distortion field that maybe it worked with journalists in a way that Travis he either didn't, or he didn't want to, or he didn't think it was a move of integrity to do so. What's your sort of sense there?
Yeah, I wasn't there when Steve Jobs got fired, so I can't really comment on that. But I do feel like they're very different characters, right? Like one of them is a real deep. I think of Steve Jobs as an artist, right, and a genius product thinker, and he was lauded as an innovator for the longest time in the press. It is unclear whether he would still be lauded today in the press. I do believe there was a political dimension to Travis' departure that wouldn't exist today. Or rather that didn't exist at the time of Steve Jobs. And there was a brand, like a very different brand between the two founders.
Yeah. You mentioned Ayn Rand earlier. Like I do see Travis as like a character, out of that book.
100%. And for the longest time, his profile picture on Twitter was the cover of the Fountainhead. And he's been saying in the press that The Fountainhead was his favorite book and such. And when you do that, again, especially in today's climate, that just puts a giant red bullseye on your back, right? By the way, people don't know, but Steve Jobs at some point in an interview also said that Atlas Shrugged was one of his favorite books.
Yeah.
He did not get nearly as much flack as you would today if you said that.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting to think about Ayn Rand's legacy and how, is there an author more polarizing than her that was writing at her time period? Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm curious, are there strategic moves, not personnel-wise, but just like business strategy-wise, that you think Uber, that you might have done differently? Obviously, Uber's a very successful company, but if you were the CEO, you might have done differently. And maybe it's a segue just into how transportation is evolving, and who might be the winners there.
Yeah, I do think Uber was late to the micromobility revolution. And so as a result, today they exited the field and they just took a stake in Lime. And I think had it been, I think we got onto micromobility something like 12 or 18 months after it really blew up. If we hadn't been this late, I think we should have had a seat at the table, because this is very obviously like a significant part of the future of transportation.
Talk a bit and say more about micromobility. You wrote you post on it, but how do you sort of, and putting COVID aside, assuming everything gets back to normal, how do you see that evolving, the micromobility wars, et cetera?
Yeah, I think I'm very bullish on micromobility very, very broadly, right? And so it's just electric bikes and scooters, right? Very concretely. Now about the companies themselves, like I don't know, right? I know that it's a very tough business. It's very capital intensive, and so the founders might just get diluted to hell before reaching any meaningful exit. And it is the unit economics are tough. It's a very, very tough business, and operationally it's very tough. And it's funny because people said, it's so much better than rideshare because you have no driver, right? And actually, sure, you have no driver, but the upside of drivers is that nobody is throwing drivers up the Golden Gate Bridge, right? And nobody is stealing your drivers, and you don't lose your drivers, right? And so the capex of micromobility businesses is huge, because you have to buy these vehicles, and the life expectancy out there on the roads is very low. But yeah, I mean, I'm still immensely bullish on the future of micromobility, because I really think it is the future of transportation, right? It's like better on almost every single dimension. It is textbook disruption in that it is disruption from the bottom, right? It is a cheaper way to move around that is non-attractive to incumbents to pursue. It's literally it's about the same speed as a car, because cars are just so slow today in cities. So it's about the same speed. And this one is a bit more controversial, but it's actually a lot safer than cars, right? And people always say, well, like, look at how many people die on a bike. And I'm like, well, every time someone dies on a bike, it's because they were hit by a car, right? The bike is not the problem. The car is the problem, right? Let's just build bike lanes. And when you look at what happened in Nordic European countries after they invested hugely in bike lanes in the 70s, fatalities per 100,000 went down a lot. And so, I mean, when two bikes collide, it's fine. Like, people are maybe a bit bruised. When two cars collide, it's a whole different story. It's a lot more inclusive, because, I mean, bikes are much cheaper than cars. It's a lot greener because they're electric. And also the car is like 4,000 pounds, right? So it's like 95% of the energy deployed by the car is actually for moving itself, right? The scooter is going to be 40 pounds, right? So that balance is flipped, right? Cars are just so inefficient and so ungreen. So, I mean, I could go on and on. They're more space efficient, which is the whole, I mean, it solves traffic, right? It just solves it. So it's just a panacea. I really think trillions of dollars of value could be unlocked with that transition in the next few decades. And it's going to happen. It has to.
And what's going to determine whether the winner is, one of the native, scooter companies already, or companies that don't exist yet, or Uber or other sort of incumbents that are, moving into that space? Yeah,
I would bet on one of the upstarts in there, like the Limes and Birds of the world, because there are, again, like, you do need to acquire the operational expertise to operate these businesses, and it takes a long time, and they're getting pretty darn good at it. It is capital intensive, and at this point there is a good amount of consolidation going on in the industry. And I think that investors would be a lot more wary at this point to fund a new scooter player because they've seen how it played out with the other ones. And they're like, okay, what is your advantage? It's not clear. So I would bet on Bird or Lime, as the winners in this space.
You had a blog post about how Apple is actually more software than a hardware company. In some sense. Talk a little bit about what you were trying to do with that post, or what you think people don't fully appreciate about Apple.
Yeah, I made a survey. I mean, the sample size is very small, right? Maybe 1,000 or so. But I asked people, would you rather an Android phone running iOS or an iOS phone running Android? And the vast majority of people say they would rather an Android phone running iOS. And I'm the same here, right? I would argue actually that Android phones, as far as hardware is concerned, have caught up and actually are ahead of iPhones now, right? And I think actually it's thanks to Apple, right? Because they educated Shenzhen, basically, and they educated China, and now China can build amazing phones by itself, right? And OLED screens were there on Android before on the iPhone, and phablets and very large phones were there before. And so it's also like a bigger ecosystem, so you have more choice. So I actually think the hardware is actually better today on Android than iOS. I think the big difference is the software, right? Because Apple is just better at building that, and it is just better at design and at product than Google. I admire Google as a company. I just don't think it's good at product and at design. And so I think the genius of Apple is in the bundling of software and hardware. Like they sell those together. They don't license iOS out. And doing that allows them to sell effectively iOS for a lot more money than they would be able to sell it if they licensed it out, right? Because when you look at the gross margins of iPhones versus Android phones, I think the gross margin of the iPhone is somewhere around 40%. And the gross margin of Android phones, like the ultimate commodity, is like 5%, if that, right? The difference there, Apple is going to make $400 on their iPhone 10, iPhone 11 now that they sell you. The difference is the software. The reason why we are paying this extra $500 is because of iOS. And so effectively you're buying iOS for $500, which effectively makes iOS one of the most expensive pieces of software that you're buying. And nobody knows that. I mean, nobody thinks it's like, oh, I'm going to buy iOS for $500. Everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to buy an iPhone for $1,000. And so psychologically, people are a lot more okay spending $1,000 on a piece of hardware than $500 on a piece of software.
When you look at Apple as a company, compare it with Uber, or just compare it with companies that we build today, they sort of have distinct principles, right? Like much more closed system. They're super secretive in the way they operate. Sort of business principles that are sort of unique to Apple. How do you think about that? Do you believe it's sort of what works for Apple can work for other types of companies, or how do you think about sort of when different organizational structures, Google, Amazon, Apple, these are all sort of cater to work to them? When you're building an organization, how does one think about the various different trade-offs one can make in sort of culture and principles to have a most effective outcome?
Yeah, Ben Horowitz wrote that amazing book on this. That's called What You Do Is Who You Are recently. And one of the key insights in there is it all starts from strategy, right? It's all downstream of strategy, including culture and values. And so there is no one objectively best set of cultural values. It just depends on your cultural values need to support your strategy, right? Generally, I think it's very hard to draw lessons from Apple because it's just such a unique company and it's all very path dependent. That company is from a different era. It's got a very special DNA. It almost died a few times. So I would be very wary to draw any lesson from Apple because they are good at breaking rules, but I'm like, don't try this at home, right? It's like they're just weird, right? Just Apple. But then, yeah, I mean, like Apple's strategy is all about building the best products in the world, right? And they're like, oh, you can be first to market, you can be cheapest, or you can be best. We're best, right? And so they don't have a culture of thriftiness, for example, right? Because they don't go after price; they go after quality. Amazon, on the other hand, is in a lot more of a commodity business. It's in retail, and its value prop is actually we are the everything store, and we're cheap. We're never gonna make you think twice about buying on Amazon because it's too expensive. And so they do want to be thrifty because also they're like just in a low margins business, right? The culture that you're gonna see at Uber is also it is a less defensible business than what you're gonna see at Google or Facebook. And so it is really all about staying ahead of the curve and hustling. And that is why a decentralized model makes so much sense for Uber because you need to be close to the ground. And by the time a piece of information went from the bottom to the top and the top made a decision, which first of all wouldn't even be a good decision because it doesn't have the information. And then by the time the information reaches back to the bottom, it's already too late, right? So you need to react now, right? And then like finally, like Google and Facebook have these cultures of, they have amazing food and they have perks and all of that stuff. And again, I think that in that case, it's really more downstream of the strength of their business model. And I see a lot of cargo cultism going around how Google manages itself. And I'm like, actually, they have like cash cow. They have a hugely defensible business. They can get away with doing anything. And so as far as you know, Google is like the worst managed company. I don't think they are, right? But like you can't draw any conclusion from the way Google manages itself just because their business model is so strong, right? And so I would urge companies that fall victim to the aura of ex-Googlers to consider that and to be like, okay, Google is a cool company, but actually, do you really want to inject some of that blood into your veins? Because maybe you don't have a business model that is as strong.
Totally. You strike me as someone who's read a lot about sort of the history of Silicon Valley or technology. What do you think is misunderstood about that, or do you think that people would have a better appreciation for if they sort of went and did that study?
Yeah, I think there is too much emphasis around money today. First of all, because that sells, and some people are like, "Whoa, money," and also because it's easy to talk about. And so I think we don't talk enough about the culture of Silicon Valley. And Sakuntala Panitarasne on Twitter had that tweet recently where, and I think it's on point, she said that Silicon Valley is really focused on substance over style, right? And I think people really underestimate how Silicon Valley is doesn't care about style, right? And so you're going to see, again, billionaires who make you a hot dog and they're like wearing flip-flops and a greasy t-shirt in the middle of the Dolores Park. And you're going to see founders take VCs out for dinner and they don't go to like Pabu Izakaya and like 3-star restaurants. They're going to go to like a taqueria in the Mission, right? And so it's really about, and I know that sounds naive and but it really is true. It's really about your ideas, right? And you really do see people here who are 17 and they are not even college, they're high school dropouts and have cool, if crazy ideas. And investors are going to be like, you're raw, right? You're young and inexperienced, but I see something in you and I like your idea. And I'm going to make a bet on you and I'm going to give you some money so you go after your idea. I don't think it's very true of very many other places in the world.
In 2018, you wrote a blog post saying, move to San Francisco if you want to build a tech company. And perhaps it was because of the reasons you just mentioned. Mention any more if we didn't cover them about why that was right at the time. And I'm curious, in a post-COVID world, how much of, is it 60% right? Is it 90? Is it 10? What percent would you put to that post still being relevant?
Yeah, it's less true. I don't know how to quantify it, but it's less true. I was tempted to leave San Francisco recently. I will say that, and I do make that point in the blog post. I'm like, look, I'm not saying you should live in San Francisco your entire life. I'm saying if you spend even just 2 or 3 years here, you're going to build a network here. And that network is sticky. And once you have built your network in San Francisco, it's like you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave, kind of thing. And so spend 2 or 3 years here. And so it is certainly true that for people who have spent a few years in San Francisco, who are connected, who have their network here, the case to stay is not very strong anymore, especially these days. I mean, I'm in San Francisco right now and I'm just hanging out in my apartment and I feel silly to pay this kind of rent to just stay at my place. And so I have been tempted to move out. I still believe that for young people, for new grads, for ambitious new people who are not connected, I do believe in the value of being here after COVID. So my money is still on San Francisco today, but the case is weaker. Oh, and also, I mean, one aspect on which it is stronger actually is that thanks to COVID, the rents have gone down tremendously. I think they're down 15% year over year. You
were just describing San Francisco as a place that, really cares about ideas. And, even if someone is super young or has a non-traditional background, if they have a really compelling idea, why do you think that is, San Francisco is that way more so than somewhere like New York or LA, or like, what is it about the culture that sort of emerged that way that perhaps didn't as much in other places?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Okay, so I have 3 parts to my answer. The first one is the first one I'm going to go with like the silliest one first, but Paul Graham talks about that in one of his essays, and he says the weather plays a role, or at least it used to. Because in San Francisco, it creates more permissionless, spots where you can just experiment, right? And so the legendary startup started in a garage. You can't do that in Norway, right? You can't do that in New York. You're gonna freeze in the winter, right? So you need an office from day one. It's not just about money. It means you need something that is condoned by your surrounding system. Was here, it's like, just work in the street, work in the garage, right? So I think that is one thing. The second thing is that I think, again, it's about the selection effect, right, of moving west, right? And so California, you could say, is the America of America, right? It's like the most adventurous of the most adventurous, who kept, like, just being in the US wasn't enough, right? They had to push the frontier even then, right? And so California is like the last frontier in the US, right? And so, I think that's always been there in the culture, right? Like Steve Jobs has this amazing quote where he says, there is a sense of permission in San Francisco. There is a sense of just sleep on the beach with your girlfriend at night, right? There is a sense of experimentation there. And the third one is, I recently read that book that's called The Rise and Decline of Nations. That's amazing, blew my mind. And he talks about how the age of states actually helps entrenched interests form themselves, and basically cartels form themselves. And they then act as blocks to innovation, right? Because they want to protect their own interests, right? And so the older a state has been around, the more time these cartels had to crystallize. And the less time it has been around, the less time they had. And so California, again, as being one of the more recent states to have formed, that would be one of the explanations why it's easier to do things here.
What else did you take from that book, or any other mental models that it gave you or changed for you?
Yeah, I think that was the main one. Like, it really blew my mind, because one of the implications here is that the reason why trade is good is not because what economists call comparative advantage, which is, like, you're better at this thing and better at this thing. If we trade, we can all be better. It's actually because it makes it harder for cartels to form, right? Because when you are in a market of 1,000 people, it's very easy to just like take the other guy who sells shoes and tell them like, hey, let's agree to like not sell our shoes for less than $50 a piece, right? But when all of a sudden you're competing against a million other companies, it's much harder for you to coordinate. So that was one of the counterintuitive conclusions of the book.
In San Francisco, one thing that's always sort of confused me a little bit is why, people say that San Francisco is too powerful, tech companies are too powerful. In some ways, they certainly are, but they are powerful. How come they can't coordinate, a few hundred votes to, protect their own narrow interests in local politics? Why do you think it is?
Yeah, I think, again, the most charitable explanation here is going to be that nerds are not good at politics. And so, again, it comes back to that focus on substance, right? And I think for a long time, that's been a feature and not a bug of Silicon Valley. And now it's got to catch up. And so you kind of see it with like the Congress appearances of Zuck, which were not great, right? And you can tell that he doesn't really know what game he's playing, which is like not a game of substance. It is a game of appearances, right? So I think Silicon Valley is catching up on that, but I don't think it's very politically gifted.
Yeah. It is really interesting. The sort of insult tech bro has really stuck over the last like 5 years, decade. But when you think of bro, you think of like a jock, or you think of like, an athlete, or Mr. Beautiful, or whatever, and that's not what you think of when you think of nerd. And so it's just interesting how either those terms have like conflated into the same thing, or as Silicon Valley has gotten more popular, it's gone sort of beyond pure nerds into more hybrids. Just more.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the notion of tech bro is like oxymoronic. It's preposterous. Yeah, I mean, we're nerds, we're not bros, right? We're not jocks. And so then people are going to tell you like, well, the term has evolved. It's like, no, it hasn't. Like, people still mean something when you say bros, and they don't mean nerd, and they don't mean a guy in his underwear eating like cold pizza and drinking Diet Coke at 4 a.m. in the morning, like coding. Yeah. This is not the image that people have when you say bro. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about you. I haven't seen the bros, and supposedly I was at Uber where like they're supposed to congregate. I don't know where they were, but I didn't see them.
I don't see what I would call bros. I would say I think venture capitalists are more likely to be like MBAs, than nerds. But they're like somewhat hybrids. But even still, I mean, it's not like fraternity brothers at University of whatever.
Yeah, like the chest bumps and like the chug. I haven't seen very much of that.
It's not that. I want to transition to another blog post you wrote about the book "Seeing Like a State." And so you also read book, Order Without, what is it? Order Without
Design.
Yes, Order Without Design. Talk a little bit about that blog post, or why the James Scott book was interesting to you, and where you see that play out in the real world.
Yeah. So the TLDR of the book, and by the way, I'm slightly frustrated every time, and I think I commit this mistake in my blog post. Like, people, every time they talk of this book, they should also talk about the ribbon form. post that's called a big little idea called legibility, I believe, because this is how everybody heard of the book. So I think it's a good introduction to it. Basically, the idea is that states and institutions of power in general, right, so that includes companies, are going to try to distort reality so it becomes more legible for them, right? And so they give this example of like, okay, you have an organic forest that's messy, and then you have a forest that is built by a state that is a grid, right? Because grids, just like people like grids, and it's like it's more legible, it's more easy to understand. And the grid is just like the outermost layer of legibility, but really it's trying to force reality into this very limited space that fits your mind. And so I think people don't like chaos, right? And I think they don't realize that nature is naturally chaotic, right? And that actually you get an immense value out of that chaos, right? And so again, that was one of the things that I learned from Uber is like, I think decentralization comes with chaos, right? And you see that even with the web. Like the web is decentralized and every website is its own design and it's like different languages and all of that stuff. So decentralization means chaos. I think decentralization is good. The only way you answer to people who are like, but it's so chaotic, is to own it, right? And to be like, yep, this is good. This is how we want it to be. And Travis would always talk of that line between chaos and order. And he says, you kind of always want to be towing the line, right? You always want to be on the side of chaos. And if you're too far on the side of chaos, then everything collapses. But if you're too far on the side of order, then you're like a bureaucracy and you can't move anymore, right? So you have to find that right balance. And so I wish people recognized the value that there is in chaos.
Yeah. You also wrote another blog post where you talk about the tough tomato principle. The great weirding of the world. Why don't you describe what you were trying to get across there? Yeah.
Oh, I wish I called it something else today. I think actually I should have called it the value of mismatch. But basically, it's really a riff on Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message," which I think people misunderstand, which is that the content of the world deform itself to fit the systems that we build inside the world. And so the example in that blog post is tomatoes, right? Like tomatoes actually. During World War II were very expensive because there was a shortage of labor because of the war. And so they invented a mechanical tomato harvester. It was impossible to make it work because it was insufficiently delicate with the tomatoes. And so their skin was very thin. And so it was just like ripping the tomatoes apart. They try to make the machine better and they can't, right? The solution was actually, let's make the tomatoes tougher, right? And so today the tomatoes that we eat are tomatoes that were designed around the machine, right? And the machine is not designed around the tomato. Tomato is designed around the machine. And so you see that all the time, right? And every time you see a new paradigm come out, you see people who try to shoehorn the previous way of doing things onto the new paradigm, right? And so, famously, the very first content on TV was just literally recorded theater plays or recorded radio talk shows, right? That's the origin of like the talk shows. And it took people, I think, a good decade before they were like, oh, actually, we can move the camera and we can do cuts and we can, oh, wow, it's a movie, right? And so it always takes people a few years to like a decade to like realize what is the form of content that is native to a new medium. And when I say medium, I mean it like in a broader sense. Like again, when we discovered how to work iron and we made iron bridges, like the very first iron bridges were made in the same way as we made wooden bridges. It's like, no, actually you have to adapt the shape to like the new material that you're working with and its constraints and its capabilities. And I think, again, I call this period of mismatch, I call it the valley of mismatch. You have these two peaks of these two paradigms, and in the middle, you have the valley of mismatch. And you see that everywhere. Once you start paying attention to it, you see it everywhere. And you also see everywhere the medium, the message adapting to the medium. Like just the other day, I was walking in San Francisco, and I saw this hotel that's called Good Hotel San Francisco, right? The reason why it's called that is because of Google, right? So it's actually the real world is actually now adapting to the internet, not the other way around.
Yeah, totally. Another book you wrote a book review on is Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Why don't you talk about what was most interesting to you, or what most inspired you, and what's most relevant to today in that book?
Yeah, so the book very briefly says there are two ways to voice your disagreement about something. One of them is exit. So it's like, oh, I don't like the way Coca-Cola is doing business anymore. I'm going to stop buying Coca-Cola and I'm going to start buying Pepsi. And the other is voice. It's like, oh, I'm going to write a letter to my legislator to tell them to stop Coca-Cola or whatever. And so the book makes like an interesting counterintuitive point, which is that by introducing exit in some institutions, you actually weaken them and you actually weaken the value of voice because these institutions can only change themselves through voice. And so one example is public schools, right? Like public schools are not under any market pressure. They don't care about making profit. And so if you exit a public school because you're dissatisfied, you are actually taking your voice out. And so you're taking out the only thing that could have made it change, right? Which is an interesting insight. I mean, but generally, I believe exit is a vastly superior voice to force to voice, right? Because first of all, it's multi-threaded. It's much easier to exit. Like you make a billion exit decisions every day when you're like in a supermarket. You're like, no, I'm not taking this detergent because it's too expensive. I'm taking this one instead, right? I think voice is easily distorted. It's very easy for a small minority of people to make themselves very loud. I think voice leads to the dictature of the articulate, right? You shouldn't even have to know how to read or speak to just put the detergent back on the shelf, which is what you do with exit. Balaji Srinivasan gave an amazing talk about exit and voice as it pertains to politics, right? And I still believe that, one of the most important forces that led to political reforms in Europe in the 19th century and like late 18th century was actually America, right? Now there was an exit that was possible, right? And I think it is a bit sad that today there is no political exit possible anymore. And I would be very excited about something that creates that again.
Yeah. And Balaji's written a lot about it, as have others, about sort of the charter city movement, the opportunity to bring sort of competitive governance. And obviously he's a good mutual friend of both of ours. Is there anywhere where you have a difference of opinion than Balaji, would you say, whether it's on the charter city stuff or whether it's on the sort of media tech stuff or transhumanism more broadly, or would you say, pretty aligned across the board?
No, I'm pretty aligned with him.
Yeah.
I think he's an amazing thinker. There are some points where I might be slightly more moderate, but I'm very aligned on the broad strokes.
Yeah, totally. One thing he's inspired by is Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew. You've also read about Lee Kuan Yew. What is most inspiring to you about his story or the Singapore story that you think perhaps is not as appreciated as it should be?
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. It was a fisherman's village. I don't know if it was actually a fisherman's village, but it was nothing just 70 years ago, right? And today it is a first world country. And like the name of the book that Lee Kuan Yew wrote is on point. It's From Third World to First World, right? And it shows that is possible, right? That is not the only country that did it. By the way, South Korea did something similar. Taiwan did something similar. Japan, to a lesser extent, really took off after World War II. It is possible to do that, right? And so there is hope, right? You look at any third world country today. Again, South Korea, I think, was poorer than like Nigeria just 60 years ago. And today it is just as rich as, I believe, Portugal or Italy, right? So, and then I think one fascinating thing about Lee Kuan Yew is that he broke a lot of rules, right? And so he's very philosophically challenging, right? For like the free market types. Because civil liberties are limited in South Korea, in Singapore, and it is an authoritarian government. Liberty of expression is limited, and it's very limited in a lot of ways, and it really works, right? And so I think one of the things that I really learned from reading Lee Kuan Yew is the value of pragmatism, right? I find that the free market type people, free market fundamentalists, commit to some extent the same category of mistake as communists did, which is just look in front of you, dude. Like, it's not working. It's like, no, it's not real communism. It's like, no. Like, it's just look in front of you. It's not working, right? And so I see the same thing with the free market types. Like, there are some cases where it's just not working, right? And so I think it's super important to always take reality as the starting point and to be pragmatic and to be like, okay, we do whatever works. Theory be damned, right? Yeah.
And so when we look at Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, I don't know, the countries you mentioned, the countries that have grown so fast, what is the common thread that ties them together? Like, what do they have that, Nigeria or other countries that haven't, don't?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, well, I think the first thing is a very strong rule of law, right? Being merciless on corruption, right? I think that's like the first thing. Singapore was obsessive. All of these countries were about education. That was like the first thing that Lee Kuan Yew did. It was like, this is just our entire value is our people, right? And so Singapore has all of these programs where they send their people to Harvard and Stanford and such. And then when you come back, so you don't have to pay anything. The Singaporean government pays for everything. And then when you come back, you actually have to work for X years in the government, right? Singapore also placed a huge amount of emphasis on the competence of their public workers, right? And the ministers in Singapore made millions. it's indexed, I think, on like the top 10% of the private sector, right? I certainly do wish that public workers in the US were paid more, right? Like you can't attract talent if you don't pay people. There is this other book that's called How Asia Works. I don't know if the empirical research really bears its thesis, but the thesis is that, and again, contra the free market fundamentalist beliefs, but it's that you actually do need protectionism and you do need mercantilism to help a country take off, right? Again, like the answer of the economist is always the comparative advantage. And it's like, oh, even if you suck at making cars, it doesn't matter because you can sell wheat or whatever. But actually, these are like very low value add activities. And so I think Ben Wang calls it absolute advantage is what you care about. And so your company has no chance at catching up from like being a third world country and in making cars with GM and Ford, right? And so you need to kind of like give it a head start. You need to like help it, right? And so you need to protect them at least over the short term against the competition of GM and Ford so that they can build up their expertise. And then little by little, you force them to actually compete internationally and then they actually compete. And now you've grown a local champion. Like South Korea has done that more than anybody, I think. Again, I don't know if I believe it 90%, but it is a compelling case.
Yeah, totally. Tyler Cowen had a post a few months ago called State Capacity Libertarianism. Some people saw that as sort of libertarians surrendering, like, hey, we're never going to get our version. You know, we keep losing. We need to sort of compromise. Others saw it as sort of maturing, like, hey, you know, you had sort of childlike vision. Now it's time, you know, in the real world, there are governments and governments, you know, exercise monopoly on violence. And it's time you sort of join the party or grow up. Is that more where you see it? Or
Yeah. I view it, first of all, as like a genius reframing.
Yeah.
And I also take issue with the fact that it seems to conflate cause and effect. And it's like, oh, look, like no big country has a small state. And so it's like, well, actually, because the state is just capturing more and more of the country. So, but I think there is something to be said about, you see a lot of libertarians who lean anarchists. And I'm like, libertarianism in my mind is not at all an anarchist philosophy. Like libertarianism very clearly needs the state because libertarianism is going for a state of things that is unnatural, right? Like liberty and property rights are not natural. Like if you go to like the savannah and you look at a lion eating an animal, like go ask the lion about like the property rights, right? That is not a natural set of things. So you need an entity, a strong entity to protect your property rights and to protect your freedom. And then I'll also say, like, again, to whatever extent there is an anarchist strain in libertarianism, I think it is mistaken because, look, anarchy was the starting point to some extent, right? It's like we started with no structure. And so it is a very unstable equilibrium, right? If we evolved to this stage, it's like wishing, it's like, oh, why don't we push? Wouldn't it be neat if we push this boulder up this hill over there? It's like, well, actually, this is where the boulder started. There's a reason why it's down the hill now, right? So we need to find a way that is compatible with Western ideals and that is a stable equilibrium. And so I do believe that the idea of state capacity is that.
Totally. And another thing you've gone pretty deep on is theory of the firm by Coase, I believe, but also just game theory more broadly. Explain your interest there, how you think it's sort of misperceived or what's important to know or how that sort of affects your work on a day-to-day.
Yeah. Well, on the day-to-day, I don't know. I'm just...
Or just mental models about how you think about
it. Well, okay. So in a nutshell, the theory of the firm is Coase asks the questions like, okay, we take firms and companies for granted, but actually, if the free market is so great, why don't we do everything in the free market? Because firms are not a free market. Internally, you're just, you're paid a fixed... Basically, a firm is like, oh, I'm going to pay you X $1,000 a month, and it's just like unlimited access to your time, right? And they just tell you what to do. The answer is, again, to put it in a nutshell, is transaction costs. Right. And it's like, actually, sure, firms internally are slightly less efficient than markets because markets are just really good at assigning resources. But what you win is that when you're in the market, you need to like find people, you need to sign a contract, you need to, when there is a dispute with them, you need to escalate that to the justice system, which is very costly and all of that. Right. Whereas in a firm, you have everybody under one roof. They've been interviewed before. You have this ongoing relationship with them. And when something is wrong, you just go talk to your manager. So you have almost this like second degree judicial system in the firm. And there is no contract to sign every time you want to talk to someone. And I was thinking of that when I was in general, actually on a day-to-day basis, when I was at Uber, I was just like chatting with someone on Slack that had never heard about before. And I was like, hey, I hear you're the right person to talk to about this. Can you help me with that? And they will help me. And I was like, man, that's pretty neat. Like this is like a very low friction thing, right? I think it is very interesting because people have been saying for a few decades, and so this theory has been somewhat discredited at this point, but people have been saying for a few decades that actually the internet would make the firm smaller and it would make us trend closer to like the free market ideal, right? Because transaction costs go down, it's very easy to find people, you can have reputation system and such. I still do believe it, right? Like at this point, people are like, look, I mean, you've been saying this for like 2 decades, it's not true. And I just think things are taking a long time, but we are seeing it, right? And we're seeing it with Uber, for example, right? Like Uber, you could think of Uber as like a reshuffling of the firm, right? Like it used to be that you had limo companies that had drivers on their payroll. And it was just because it was hard to measure the output of the driver and all of that. And now with tech, actually, it is much easier to like onboard the drivers and recruit them and measure the output and pay them. And so I think it makes complete sense to have drivers in this ecosystem to be independent contractors, right? And so I do believe we are going to see more and more of that because I just think it is so efficient to have people work under that model. And so I do believe this is going to be a huge trend of the future. And I am excited about what I call white collar gig economy. Right now, the gig economy has been blue collar, like drivers and delivery drivers and such. I think we're going to see an Uber of engineers, for example.
Yeah. It's really interesting. We have this concept that, software eats the world, markets are eating the world. I think there is a directly competitive idea, and it's more like egalitarianism is also like as we get richer, we get more egalitarian. And maybe I don't know what the right words are. Maybe it's like capitalism eats the world, communism eats the world at the same time. And so, one example here is, we thought, or a lot of people thought that crypto would enable people to become, freelancers or entrepreneurs because, it would just make, a lot of the sort of bottlenecks, it would reduce a lot of bottlenecks, just make things a lot sort of easier, liquid contracts, stuff like that. And it turns out that actually what is making more people entrepreneurs is like cancel culture, is sort of like, people threaten that they can't speak freely and are gonna want to leave their job or don't want to have that. And so we understand software is eating the world. I don't think we fully appreciate or understand the dynamics behind this idea of like egalitarianism, radical egalitarianism, also eating the world, and what that means. Tribalism, like software hasn't eaten healthcare, education, housing, and in fact, it's the other thing that has eaten it. And so that's something I've been thinking about and just curious to dig deeper on.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point. I had never thought about that because it is true that the gig economy is in a way exacerbating inequalities, right? Because you pay people according to their outputs and the outputs of people is not equal, right? And so two senior engineers at a tech company today are going to make, say, I don't know, $300K, right? And I think if you actually just pay them by the output, one of them should be paid $100K and the other should be paid $1 million, right? There is actually such a thing as a 10x engineer. Once you do measure the output, I think we're going to see more of that inequality and we're going to realize that we were subsidizing the inefficient worker with the efficient one. So and in parallel to that, I do agree that people care more and more about inequality. Again, I think this is a lot pushed by the media. How do you think these two will reconcile?
Civil war.
Yeah, checks out.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's funny. I read Peter Zeihan, and his basic point is like, no matter what America does, like over the next 20 or 30 years, it'll be totally fine because it's an energy exporter, because its geography is so good, because its demographics are so good, and more so just because all the other countries are fucked. He thinks China is totally fucked, and maybe he's wrong. He's just one person, but he thinks basically like we've been subsidizing the global order since World War II, and as we pull out more because we don't need their energy and other resources as much, those countries are depending on us, and that they will implode and it'll be just chaos everywhere else. So overall, I think we'll be like okay in the grand scheme of things, but I think it'll be very messy couple of decades, especially because we don't have a common enemy to unite us unless we sort of escalate things with China, which we have, which is very possible, and which actually may be a good thing if we're trying to I am a believer, sort of cynically, like in the idea of the Bedouin quote of me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, my brother and my cousin against the other family. And right now, if we don't have another family, we're probably just gonna fight amongst ourselves. But and I was lamenting this to a friend recently about like, oh man, increased polarization, and he's like, well, it's better than like Russia or like China, where there's no polarization because people can't even like and not now, but like in their worst times, couldn't
Yeah.
speak freely. So yeah, I think these issues are just going to keep battling themselves out. One thing, if you're asking me for like optimism here, the thing that I'm excited about, if crypto really sort of works well, I'm excited about this idea of expanding equity ownership, to a lot more people, not just employees but also users, in ways that align incentives on the way up instead of on the way down, or post. Because people don't right now, when people see Amazon or Facebook or whatever, Uber, they just see someone rich and they didn't get rich. They don't sort of make the connection that money goes to tax dollars that then goes to services for them. So, but if instead they had some equity or some tokens or ownership in the platform on the way up, they would be rooting for these companies. So I hope that we can reduce inequality by either increasing marginal productivity of workers and or just getting more owners. Like instead of UBI, like it'd be like universal basic equity or something, or stocks.
Yeah. I mean, it is a way to give everybody skin in the game. Absolutely.
Yes.
Let's just hope. I think it's just such a pity that the SEC won't let us do it. But yeah.
What did you take from the Will Durant book, Lessons of History?
Oh wow, I read it such a long time ago.
No, if you don't have it, you got it.
I think I really loved the insight. It's like, look, the rich are going to have the choice between voluntarily redistributing their wealth or be subject to the forced redistribution of poverty. Right? It's like sooner or later, like there is revolution, and like there is this cyclical approach to the cycle of growing discontent about inequality that leads to some form of revolution, right? And so the rich are going to have to agree to some redistribution at some point.
Yeah, and it's just what's the best way for that to happen?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer here. I think both sides have like a super good point. I'm aesthetically opposed to a tax on capital.
Yeah.
I've seen it in France, and it led to a fleeing of millionaires. I don't know if the same would happen in the US, but it is possible. And also, I think we need capital, right?
Yeah.
Capital is a good thing. There are some ways in which our current tax system is regressive, and so that just should be squashed. And so that would be the first things to look at for sure.
What did you take from Why Information Grows?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. I mean, to your point earlier about America, like there is also a case here that is very bullish about America, right? And so Why Information Grows makes the point that the growth and size of economies is a function of how much it helps human units manage complexity, right? And so it's like, I alone, I can make a pie, right? But I don't have enough knowledge to make something more complex, like, I don't know, a desk, right? I'm going to need you to make the tabletop, and I'm going to make the fit, right? And so little by little, as economies make products that are more and more complex, like in your MacBook, like no single human knows how to make more than 1% of your MacBook, right? And so Apple is really just an entity that aggregates thousands and thousands of people that collectively know how to make a MacBook, but no single one of them knows more than 0.1% about how to make it. I knew someone, an industrial designer who worked at Apple. Her job was the power button, not the volume buttons. You would assume they're the same. No, like her job was the power button, right? So I just think that's amazing how, like, there is this guy, I forgot his name. His bio on Twitter is everything around me is someone's life work. And I would say actually it's like thousands of people's life work, right? In your iPhone, you have millions of people's life work. And so anyway, like Why Information Grows comes up with a way to quantify that and to quantify how complex the products that are manufactured by companies. And they made this amazing website that's like Data Vivo or something that shows you the dependency graph of economies, right? And so it's like, okay, you start with like raw materials, right? Like oil and whatnot, right? And little by little, you move up in layers of abstraction. And then at the top, you're going to have like industrial machinery and MacBooks and transistors and CPUs and all of that stuff, right? And so again, it makes the case that the higher a company, a country goes in that value chain, the better. Today, America is one of the countries, if not the country that is highest in this value chain. And China is just not that good yet, right? Like China still is not great at making cars. It's still not great at making semiconductors. It still doesn't make great planes, right? And they're aware of that weakness, and the CCP is looking at this. But I think that is the bearish case. That is one of the bearish cases against China. The other one being demography, and that is one of the bullish cases for the U.S.
No, you wrote a book review on the seven powers. Why don't you talk about a couple of the main points you found most interesting or that people should appreciate from that book?
Yeah. So the idea is moats, right? And moats are the forces that insulate you from competition, right? And so it's okay. Why can anybody not copy you, right? And so seven powers just lists seven, and it claims it is exhaustive, a list of seven possible moats, right? And so it's one, network effects. So it's Facebook, like you can't copy their user base. Switching costs, cornered resources, like, oh, I just have all the AI engineers, or I have all the diamonds. Oh man, I don't know if I remember them all by heart, but process power, which is again like the operational power that I was talking about for Bird earlier. Amazon has a ton of process power. Corner positioning, so it's like basically disruption theory. It's like you're positioned in a way that other people cannot follow you. And I'm missing two. Economies of scale. So it's like people cannot follow you because they didn't have the scale from day one. Yeah, I think in general that is one of the very first. Oh, the last one is brand, right? That is one of the very first mental models when I look at a new business or at a business opportunity. I'm like, okay, what is the moat, right? And very rarely do I see a company that is successful that doesn't have a moat, right? And I always start from the starting point that like, okay, if I don't see the moat, it's not because it doesn't have one, it's because I don't understand it, right? And so very often you always see there was this prophetic tweet from Mark Andreessen, I think in 2013 or something, when GoPro went public, and he was like, it's a commodity, right? And everybody was like, no, they're building a community around like extreme sport lovers. And he was like, yeah, that's what everybody who sells a commodity would like you to believe, but it's a commodity we'll see in 5 years, right? And 5 years later, sure enough, like GoPro's stock has tanked, right? We saw the same thing with like Blue Apron recently. Like, what's the moat? It's like so easy to just like put food in a box and ship it to people, right? Maybe there is some amount of process power. We're seeing the same thing, I think, with mattress companies. Now, all of these DTC mattress companies, and it's not clear to me what is the moat. They're just selling mattresses, right? Yeah, I think in the world of software, it is the concept of moat is a bit less relevant, just because software almost always has a moat. Right, yeah. You always have. I think like one of the biggest moats in software is like switching costs, right? So for example, Stripe, like you build it into your code base. Like switching out of Stripe is like super hard, right? Your to-do list, same. Like I have all of my to-dos and things now. If I wanted to move away, it would be super hard. I've been tempted to move away from iOS, but same. Like, well, iOS also has the network effect with the apps and FaceTime and iMessage, but also like all of my stuff is in Apple's ecosystem, and so there is this switching cost. So again, every time you see a successful business, I think it's like super useful to ask yourself, okay, which of the 7 moats does it have?
Yeah. I'd be really interested in the idea of moats as it relates to like thinking about your career and your skill sets and sort of your assets and people building their own sort of personal moats based on their sort of unique skill sets they can develop and then resources and experiences as for sort of career development. I thought that was a helpful construct.
Well, for sure. Like what examples do you have in mind? Like what do you think are the biggest personal moats?
Yeah, I think there's a few. So for example, like take someone like Elad Gil, like he has invested in, I don't know, a dozen, maybe 20 unicorns at this point. And that is just like, you can never take that away from him. And it's so hard for somebody else to do because the feedback loop is so hard or so long, such that if he sort of just he could be in a coma for 2 decades, come back out and be still one of the best angel investors of all time. And I think what's interesting and he could have entered his coma like 7 years ago. And so the work of being a great investor is basically making a series of great investments like early in a short period of time, or early enough that you can sort of wait it out. So I think angel investing is pretty interesting if you can do it, or invest if you can do it well and if you can do it early. I think someone like Tyler Cowen, who's just built basically this encyclopedia, of knowledge, and then also this like diehard audience over like, a decade or two is really hard to do. So moats in the sense of, I think like things that are very hard for people to do, like certain accomplishments that are just like indescribably oppressive, or not indescribable, totally legibly oppressive, like a unicorn company or investing in unicorns, or just a piece of writing that is sort of proof of work for how incredibly intelligent someone is, and or a relationship to an audience. Those are some that come to mind.
Yeah, I think also the advice of like being the best in like a niche makes a lot of sense, like looking under the moat, because it's like, first of all, you put yourself in a thin market, and so you increase the switching costs, because this is like one expert. There are really not that very many guys who are good at like lithium ion batteries for like electric cars or whatever. Yeah. And so it's time, right? So switching costs, I think, is a moat. And yeah, brand. I think all of these things is really brand. Like, and I think like it really speaks to the importance, for example, of having an internet presence. I keep asking everybody. I'm distressed. Like, so few people are on Twitter or like have blogs. Everybody should be on Twitter and have a blog.
Totally. And when you combine things you're not supposed to combine, that's pretty interesting. Like Joe Rogan, for example, like, comedian, UFC commentator, and now like, best podcaster in the world. Such an interesting background. So you maybe this is how we'll close. Like, you've been sort of active on Twitter for a while. What has sort of surprised you about your sort of Twitter usage, or what misconceptions do you think people have about sort of living or thinking in public in such a way?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is people really overestimate the downside of thinking in public, and they underestimate the upside tremendously, right? It's a muscle, and I was the same, right? And I was intimidated all the time before. I was like, oh, like, should I tweet this? It's dumb. And now I just tweet whatever crosses my mind all the time. And maybe it's dumb. Maybe people are like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. But I wrote that blog post that's called "Nobody Cares." People really don't understand. People are very self-absorbed. Like, they're very wrapped up in their own shit. Like, they don't care about you. Right. And so really the content out there is bad already. And so worst case, they're going to forget about you, right? They're literally not going to see you because they're just going to scroll past you. And like literally 2 seconds later, they're going to have forgotten that like you ever said what you said. Right. And the upside is like little by little, first of all, you work that communication muscle, because really Twitter helps you talk in aphorisms and forces you to like be a good, concise communicator. Right. And I think Twitter is really unlike any other social media because it's the biggest contribution to your career, right? It really puts you out there. It helps you build that brand. It helps you build connections. Some of my best friends today I met on Twitter. Some of my favorite people I met on Twitter, and I've had access to people who are the very best in their field, and I could never have dreamt of having access to them outside of Twitter. And it's just so good to just like, you read a book and you tweet, oh, I just finished the book by @ and you mentioned the guy. And then you get into a debate with the author immediately. I'm like, what other service offers you that? This is just amazing. I think everybody should just be on Twitter at this point.
And when people say, or when you say overestimating the downsides, you've experienced a few mobs attacking you, and you've lived to tell the tale, or they just forget about it 24 hours later.
Yeah, 24 to 72. Yeah, and I mean, like, again, yeah, I say that about the downside as someone who has been under these mobs. I assume you have to. I think it's a rite of passage on Twitter. I have been surprised about how anything you say can infuriate people. Like, one of the mobs went after me and Patrick Collison because we were suggesting ways in which books could evolve in the future. It's like, oh, actually, you could have an app, and people were like, oh, you're like a murderer, you should go to jail. I was like, what? Another one was, I was saying that the barriers to entry in tech were low, and like more people should be engineers. I had so much of an outrage go after me after that. That was the one that was like most violent. It was pretty nasty. When you're in it, it's really not funny. Like, the one thing I would recommend is just like turn off the notifications for Twitter and for that tweet, and disable everything, and just like wait it out for 24 or 72 hours. I will also say that like, this is when I changed my profile picture, because I used to have a profile picture in there that showed my face. And since I went, now I have some kind of painting. Since I went with that, I've had maybe 5% as much outrage as I used to.
Wow.
I noticed that a lot of the outrage was focused on my gender and skin color. It's like, oh, you're a white male, which apparently means you're not entitled to an opinion. And so, yeah, I mean, just I would recommend that as a defense mechanism to people.
Yeah, I should look into it. The ones I've had are mostly because if I ever use the word meritocracy, that is the ultimate trigger word.
What do you have in mind?
Exactly. Or people don't like income share agreements. I was really excited about them, but that's controversial.
Yeah, nope. Yeah, I will say, like, again, people overestimate, like, right now there is so much talk about cancel culture. I wish there was more courage out there, because it is a small minority that is exerting way too much power. I wish people were just like, no, I'll just speak my mind, and that's fine, right? And the consequences are very rarely as bad as you think they will be if you hold reasonable opinions. Yeah,
totally. I think it's a great place to wrap. My guest today has been Flo Crivello. The world is excited to see what you do next. And for people who want to learn more, they can follow you on Twitter. What's your handle?
Altimore, Altimor.
Perfect. Flo, this has been a great episode. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.